In the brutal world of medieval politics, some rulers are destroyed not by foreign enemies, but by the very system designed to serve them. When a king refuses to play by the ancient rules of power, when he chooses love over strategy and personal loyalty over political necessity, the crown itself becomes his executioner. How far will a court go to eliminate a monarch who threatens everything they believe kingship should be? Medieval England demanded kings of iron, warriors who lived for conquest, rulers who saw marriage as alliance and friendship as weakness. The crown was not just inherited, it was earned through blood, strategy, and the ruthless ability to command absolute loyalty from men who would rather die than kneel. In this world where a king's word was law and his strength was everything, where political survival meant crushing enemies without hesitation, one man stood to inherit the most powerful throne in Europe. His name was Edward II, son of Edward the Thirst and the Hammer of the Scots, and heir to an empire built on military dominance and iron-fisted control. To the world, he seemed born for greatness. Tall, handsome, athletic, and charming, Edward possessed every physical quality the medieval world expected from a king. His father had conquered Wales, terrorized Scotland, and commanded respect across Europe. The young prince had wealth, education, and the finest training available to any royal heir. Yet beneath the golden exterior lay something that would prove far more dangerous than any foreign invasion or noble rebellion. A king who valued personal affection over political calculation, who chose emotional bonds over strategic alliances, and who refused to sacrifice his heart for his crown. From the moment he took power, whispers began. Edward was different. Where his father had been calculating, Edward was impulsive. Where tradition demanded distance, Edward craved intimacy. Where politics required sacrifice, Edward insisted on loyalty to those he loved. His court watched in growing alarm as their new king surrounded himself with men who offered companionship rather than counsel, who provided emotional comfort rather than military strength. The nobles who had served his father recognized the danger immediately. This was not the kind of king who would expand the realm or crush rebellions. This was a man who might choose personal happiness over royal duty, who might elevate favorites over ancient bloodlines, who might destroy the very foundations of medieval kingship. They had sworn oaths to serve the crown, but what happened when the crown itself threatened everything they understood about power? Please subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep making documentaries like this. The court, that had once been the engine of English dominance, was about to become Edward's executioner. But first, they would try to control him, to force him into the mold of kingship his father had perfected. When that failed, when Edward proved that he would rather risk his throne than abandon those he loved, the machinery of royal power would turn against its own master. The king, who should have been England's greatest ruler, would instead become the cautionary tale of what happens when monarchs choose their heart over their crown. Edward II would learn that in medieval politics, love was the most dangerous weakness of all. Edward of Caernarfon entered the world in 1284 as the first English prince born in Wales, a symbol of his father's conquest and the future of English dominance. But from childhood, it became clear that this heir would defy every expectation placed upon him. While other royal sons learned to see relationships as political tools, Edward formed deep emotional bonds. While they mastered the art of royal distance, Edward craved genuine companionship. And while they prepared to sacrifice personal desires for the crown, Edward seemed determined to have both. The transformation began when Edward was still a teenager and met Piers Gaveston, a young knight from Gascony whose family had served the English crown loyally for generations. Gaveston was everything a medieval knight should be, skilled with sword and horse, intelligent, witty, and devastatingly charming. But what drew Prince Edward to him went far beyond political alliance or military partnership. Their friendship burned with an intensity that alarmed the royal court, and set tongues wagging across the kingdom. Edward showered Gaveston with gifts, lands, and titles that should have been reserved for the highest nobility. He sought his counsel on matters of state, ignored protocol to spend time with him, and defended him against critics with a passion that bordered on obsession. To observers, this was no ordinary friendship between knights. This was a bond that threatened to reshape the very nature of royal power in England. King Edward V watched his son's devotion to Gaveston with mounting concern. This was not how princes were supposed to behave. Royal affections were meant to be political calculations, not genuine emotions. Marriages were strategic alliances, not love matches. Friendships were tools for building networks of loyalty, not sources of personal fulfillment. The old king understood that his son was developing exactly the kind of weakness that medieval politics would exploit and destroy. In 1307, with Edward V aging and his heir's attachment to Gaveston growing stronger, the crisis reached a breaking point. The dying king made a decision that revealed just how seriously he took the threat. He banished Piers Gaveston from England, ordering him to leave the realm immediately and never return. It was a father's desperate attempt to save his son from himself, to tear away the relationship that threatened to destroy Edward's ability to rule effectively. But as Edward IV lay on his deathbed, he extracted one final promise from his heir, that Gaveston would remain in exile forever. The prince agreed, swearing the oath that should have ended the most dangerous friendship in English royal history. Yet even as Edward II knelt beside his father's body and accepted the crown of England, courtiers whispered that the new king's first official act would reveal whether he intended to honor that promise. The young man who had just inherited the most powerful kingdom in medieval Europe was about to make a choice that would define his reign and ultimately seal his fate. Within weeks of his father's death, Edward II shattered the promise that should have secured his reign. In direct defiance of his oath to the dying king, he recalled Piers Gaveston from exile and welcomed him back to court with honors that stunned the English nobility. The message was unmistakable. Edward would choose personal loyalty over political wisdom, emotional bonds over royal duty, and the man he loved over the kingdom he ruled. The coronation of Edward II in February 1308 should have been a moment of unity and celebration. Instead, it became a public humiliation for everyone who understood how medieval power actually worked. As the great nobles of England gathered to witness their new king's crowning, they watched in horror as Edward elevated Gaveston to the highest positions in the realm. The Gascon Knight was made Earl of Cornwall, one of the most prestigious titles in the kingdom, and granted lands and wealth that placed him among the most powerful men in England. But the real scandal unfolded during the coronation ceremony itself. While Queen Isabella, Edward's young French bride, sat in the traditional place of honor, it was Gaveston who carried the crown. Gaveston who stood at the king's right hand, and Gaveston who received the honors that should have gone to England's ancient bloodlines. The established nobility, men whose families had served the crown for generations, found themselves pushed aside for a foreign knight, whose only qualification was the king's inexplicable devotion. The feast that followed the coronation became a public disaster. Edward spent the evening focused entirely on Gaveston, ignoring his new queen, dismissing his nobles, and making it clear that his favorite's comfort mattered more than centuries of protocol. Isabella's father, Philip IV of France, had sent representatives to witness his daughter's triumph as Queen of England. Instead, they reported back that the English king seemed more interested in his male companion than his royal bride. The great earls of England, men like Henry de Lacy, Guy de Beauchamp, and Thomas of Lancaster, watched these displays with mounting rage. These were not merely breaches of etiquette, they were direct challenges to the feudal system that kept medieval England functioning. When a king elevated personal favorites over established nobility, when he ignored the hierarchies that had maintained order for centuries, when he treated royal ceremonies as opportunities to celebrate private relationships rather than public alliances, he threatened the very foundations of their power. Within months of Edward's coronation, the most powerful nobles in England began to meet in secret. They spoke in careful terms about the need for reform, about the importance of proper counsel, about the dangers of allowing foreign influences to corrupt English government. But beneath their diplomatic language lay a simple truth. They had decided that Piers Gaveston had to go, and if their king refused to see reason, they would force him to choose between his favorite and his crown. The honeymoon period of Edward II's reign was over before it had truly begun. By 1310, the great magnates of England had seen enough. What had begun as whispered complaints about royal favoritism had transformed into organized rebellion against the crown itself. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, the king's own cousin, and the most powerful earl in the realm, they formed a group that would become known as the Lords Ordainers. Their mission was simple: control the king by controlling those around him, and if Edward refused to cooperate, they would use force. The Ordainers presented Edward with an ultimatum disguised as counsel. They demanded the right to reform royal government, to approve all appointments, and to control the king's finances. But everyone understood the real target. Buried within their demands was the requirement that would define the crisis. Piers Gaveston must be exiled from England permanently, stripped of all his titles, and forbidden from ever returning to the realm. Edward's response revealed just how completely he had abandoned the political calculations that kept medieval kings alive. Rather than negotiate, rather than find face-saving compromises, rather than sacrifice his favorite to preserve his power, the king chose open defiance. He refused the Ordainers' demands, protected Gaveston's position, and made it clear that he would rather fight his own nobility than abandon the man he loved. The first exile came in 1308, forced by baronial pressure. Gaveston departed for Ireland, where Edward ensured he lived in luxury as the king's lieutenant. But within months, Edward brought him back, claiming that papal dispensation had freed him from his promises. The second exile followed in 1311, this time demanded by the Ordainers with threats of civil war. Again, Gaveston left England. Again, Edward recalled him within the year, defying his nobles and daring them to act. Each return made Gaveston more hated and Edward more isolated. The Gascon knight seemed to delight in provoking the very men who held the power to destroy him. He invented mocking nicknames for the great earls, calling the Earl of Lancaster the Fiddler, the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog, and the Earl of Gloucester Whoreson. His wit had turned venomous, his arrogance had become unbearable, and his hold over the king had grown absolute. Meanwhile, Edward's behavior grew more erratic and desperate. He showered Gaveston with ever greater honors, granted him castles and revenues that belonged to other nobles, and began treating opposition to his favorite as treason against the crown itself. The king, who should have been building alliances, was instead burning every bridge that connected him to the men who controlled England's military and financial resources. By early 1312, the kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. The Lords Ordainers had exhausted their patience with exile and recall, with compromise and defiance, with trying to reason with a king who seemed determined to choose personal devotion over political survival. They had decided that if Edward would not remove Gaveston permanently, they would do it themselves, in the most final way possible. In June 1312, the Lords Ordainers finally acted. Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, the man Gaveston had mockingly called the Black Dog, led a coordinated strike that would shatter Edward's world forever. They found Gaveston at Scarborough Castle, where the king had left him believing the fortress was impregnable. After a brief siege, hunger and hopelessness forced the royal favorite to surrender under promise of safe conduct to appear before Parliament. It was a lie. As Gaveston's escort made its way south, Warwick's men surrounded them near Deddington. The Earl himself reportedly declared that since Gaveston had called him a dog, he would discover what a dog's bite felt like. They seized the king's beloved favourite and dragged him to Warwick Castle, where the most powerful nobles in England had gathered to deliver their own form of justice. What happened next crossed every line of medieval law and custom. Without trial, without the king's consent, without even the pretense of legal process, they condemned Piers Gaveston to death. On June 19, 1312, on Blacklow Hill near Warwick, they executed the Earl of Cornwall like a common criminal. 2 Welsh soldiers ran him through with their swords, then beheaded the man who had been the second most powerful figure in the realm. The murder of Gaveston was not just the elimination of a royal favourite, it was regicide in all but name. The nobles had declared that they could kill anyone close to the king, that royal protection meant nothing when it conflicted with their will, and that Edward himself ruled only at their sufferance. They had crossed the line from opposition to open war against the crown. Please subscribe to the channel if you want more real royal stories like this. When news of Gaveston's death reached Edward, the king's response revealed the full scope of the disaster his devotion had created. Rather than negotiate with the men who had murdered his favourite, rather than seek compromise or forgiveness, Edward chose the path that would destroy his reign. He swore vengeance against every man involved in Gaveston's death, declared them traitors to the crown, and began raising armies to crush them completely. The king, who had once been charming and diplomatic, had been transformed into something far more dangerous, a medieval monarch with nothing left to lose. Edward's grief became rage, his love became hatred, and his political calculations dissolved entirely into a desire for revenge that would consume the rest of his reign. But the Lords Ordainers had chosen their course as well. Having murdered the king's favourite, having seen Edward's response, having crossed the ultimate line in medieval politics, they understood that compromise was no longer possible. They had created a king who would never forgive them, which meant their only option was to destroy him completely. Civil war was no longer a threat, it was inevitable. The civil war that followed Gaveston's murder revealed just how completely Edward had destroyed his ability to rule effectively. The king, who should have commanded absolute loyalty from his nobles, instead found himself fighting a desperate campaign against the most powerful men in his own kingdom. His armies faced forces led by his own cousin Thomas of Lancaster. His treasury hemorrhaged gold, paying for mercenaries when English knights refused to serve, and his authority crumbled with each failed attempt to crush the rebellion. But while Edward battled his own nobles, Scotland seized the opportunity to strike a blow that would define the rest of his reign. Robert the Bruce, who had spent years rebuilding Scottish resistance against English rule, recognized that a distracted and weakened English king was the perfect target for a decisive campaign. In 1314, as Edward struggled to maintain control over his own realm, the Scots laid siege to Stirling Castle, the last major English stronghold north of the border. Edward saw the Scottish campaign as his chance for redemption. A glorious military victory could restore his prestige, unite the kingdom behind the crown, and prove that he was worthy of his father's legacy. He assembled the largest army England had fielded in decades, over 20 Zered men, including the finest heavy cavalry in Europe and seasoned infantry veterans who had served his father in Wales and Scotland. On June 24, 1314, at a marshy field near Stirling called Bannockburn, that army met complete and catastrophic defeat. Robert the Bruce, commanding a force less than half the size of Edward's host, used terrain and tactics to transform English strength into weakness. The Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, shattered the English cavalry charges, while marshy ground trapped the heavily armoured knights in killing zones where Scottish foot soldiers could finish them at leisure. The flower of English knighthood died in the Scottish mud. The Earl of Gloucester fell in the first charge. Dozens of nobles and hundreds of knights were butchered or captured. Edward himself fled the battlefield in terror, abandoning his army, his baggage train, and his royal seal to escape with his life. The king, who had dreamed of military glory like his fathers, instead suffered the most humiliating defeat in English military history. Bannockburn destroyed more than Edward's army. It shattered the last foundations of his political authority. The nobles who had reluctantly followed him to Scotland returned home convinced that their king was not just politically incompetent, but militarily catastrophic. The defeat proved that Edward could not protect England's interests, could not command armies effectively, and could not maintain the military dominance that justified royal power. Thomas of Lancaster and the Lords Ordainers seized control of the kingdom's government, relegating Edward to a ceremonial role while they ruled England in everything but name. The king found himself trapped between Scottish armies that could invade at will and English nobles who treated him as a prisoner in his own palaces. Edward II was still king in title, but the crown had become an empty symbol of power he no longer possessed. In the years following Bannockburn, Edward made the fatal mistake of trying to replace what he had lost. Unable to accept that his reign was broken, he found new favorites to fill the void left by Gaveston's death. Hugh Despencer the Elder and his son Hugh the Younger became the king's new obsession, and once again Edward showered them with lands, titles and power that rightfully belonged to others. The pattern was repeating itself, but this time the kingdom had run out of patience for royal favoritism. The Despensers proved even more dangerous than Gaveston had ever been. Where the Gascon knight had been content with titles and ceremony, the Despensers used their influence to seize lands, corrupt justice, and build a private empire within the realm. Their greed was limitless, their cruelty legendary, and their hold over Edward absolute. They convinced the king to reverse his father's policies, to crush his enemies with unprecedented violence, and to rule through fear rather than consent. But the Despensers made one enemy who would prove far more dangerous than any English noble: Queen Isabella herself. Edward's wife had endured years of humiliation, watching her husband lavish attention on male favorites while treating her as a political convenience. When the Despensers began seizing lands that belonged to the royal family, when they controlled access to the king so completely that Isabella could barely speak to her own husband, when they convinced Edward to treat her with open contempt, the Queen of England decided that her marriage and her loyalty to the crown had reached their end. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France on a diplomatic mission, ostensibly to negotiate with her brother, the French king. Instead, she began plotting the destruction of her husband's reign. At the French court, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to the continent. Mortimer was everything Edward was not: a skilled military commander, a charismatic leader, and a man who understood how to build political coalitions through strength rather than sentiment. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small force of mercenaries and exiled nobles. They expected resistance, prepared for siege warfare, and planned for a long campaign to overthrow the king. Instead, they found a kingdom that welcomed them as liberators. City after city opened its gates to the queen. Noble after noble abandoned Edward to join the invasion. The Despensers' reign of terror had made them so hated that their enemies lined up to destroy them. Edward fled west toward Wales, but his support melted away with each passing day. The king, who had once commanded the loyalty of the entire realm, found himself abandoned by everyone except the favorites who had caused his downfall. When Mortimer's forces finally cornered the royal party in November 1326, Edward discovered that even his own guards were willing to hand him over to his enemies. The King of England had become a prisoner, and the crown was about to change hands through force rather than inheritance. The man who had once ruled England from throne rooms now found himself confined in Kenilworth Castle. stripped of every symbol of royal power except the title he could no longer use. Edward II, King of England in name only, faced a humiliation no English monarch had ever endured: formal abdication forced by his own subjects. The machinery of government that had once served his will was now dismantling his reign piece by piece, legally and systematically. In January 1327, a parliament controlled by Isabella and Mortimer assembled to complete Edward's destruction. They presented him with a choice that was no choice at all: abdicate voluntarily in favor of his young son Edward III, or face deposition as an incompetent tyrant who had forfeited his right to rule. The delegation that visited Kenilworth included bishops, earls, and representatives of the commons, all speaking with one voice about the necessity of his removal. The charges against Edward revealed the complete breakdown of medieval kingship. They accused him of failing to listen to good counsel, of following evil advisers, of losing Scotland and Ireland through incompetence, of destroying the church and nobility through oppression, and of being personally inadequate to govern the realm. These were not merely political accusations. They were a fundamental rejection of his fitness to wear the crown. Edward's final moments as king captured the full scope of his fall from power. Dressed in a simple black robe rather than royal robes, surrounded by enemies rather than loyal servants, he wept openly as he surrendered the crown that his family had held for generations. The ceremony of abdication was designed to humiliate him, to strip away not just his authority but his dignity, and to demonstrate that even kings could be unmade when they failed their subjects completely. But abdication was only the beginning of Edward's punishment. Isabella and Mortimer understood that a living former king would always be a potential rallying point for rebellion. As long as Edward breathed, there was a chance that loyal nobles might attempt to restore him, that foreign powers might support his cause, or that he might escape and reclaim his birthright. The solution was elegant and terrifying. The former king would disappear into the English countryside, held in castles controlled by men who understood the price of allowing him to survive. They moved Edward from prison to prison, always under heavy guard, always in locations chosen for their isolation and security. At each stop, his treatment grew harsher, his conditions more degrading, and his hope of rescue more distant. The man who had once commanded armies and negotiated with foreign princes now depended on his captors for food, clothing, and the basic dignity of clean quarters. By the autumn of 1327, Edward had been transferred to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a fortress controlled by men who owed their loyalty entirely to Mortimer and Isabella. There, far from potential rescue and hidden from public view, the former King of England would face the final chapter of his destruction. What happened in those castle walls would remain one of medieval England's darkest secrets. On the night of September 21, 1327, screams echoed through Berkeley Castle that would haunt English history for centuries. The former King Edward II, who had survived exile, capture, and abdication, would not survive his imprisonment. What happened in those stone chambers remains one of medieval England's most horrific mysteries. But the political necessity was crystal clear. Edward had to die, and his death had to appear natural. The official story, crafted by Isabella and Mortimer, was simple and convenient. The former king had fallen ill during his captivity and succumbed to a fever that had weakened him for weeks. Natural death in medieval prisons was common enough that few would question the explanation. But witnesses at Berkeley Castle told a different tale, one so brutal that chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record it. According to multiple accounts, Edward's captors had grown impatient with waiting for natural death to solve their problem. The former king's constitution was strong, his will to live unbroken, and his potential value, as a symbol of resistance, too dangerous to ignore. Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers, the men responsible for his custody, reportedly decided to accelerate the process in a way that would leave no external marks on the body. The method they allegedly chose reflected the particular cruelties of medieval justice and perhaps the specific nature of Edward's perceived sins. chronicles described a death so agonizing and degrading that it seemed designed to punish not just Edward's political failures, but his personal relationships. The screams that pierced the castle walls that September night supposedly came from torments that combined physical agony with symbolic humiliation. When morning came, Berkeley Castle announced that Edward Plantagenet, former King of England, had died peacefully in his sleep. His body was displayed publicly to prove his death, showing no obvious signs of violence to support the official narrative. The face that had once charmed courts across Europe was arranged in peaceful repose, and the hands that had once held royal seals were folded in prayer. But even in death, Edward remained dangerous to those who had destroyed him. Within months, rumors began spreading throughout England about the true manner of his demise. The stories grew more detailed and more horrific with each telling, creating a legend of martyrdom that threatened to transform the failed king into a symbol of royal dignity brutally violated by ambitious usurpers. Isabella and Mortimer understood the threat these whispers posed to their rule. They had eliminated Edward to secure their power, but his death was creating exactly the kind of dangerous mythology they had sought to prevent. The former king was more threatening as a murdered martyr than he had ever been as a living prisoner. The reign of Edward II had ended in screams and silence, but the consequences of his destruction were just beginning to unfold across a kingdom that was starting to question whether any crown was worth the price of such brutal ambition. The death of Edward II solved nothing for the people who had orchestrated his destruction. Isabella and Mortimer discovered that murdering a king, even a failed one, carried consequences that would eventually consume them both. Within 3 years of Edward's death, their own reign of terror had created the same kind of desperate opposition that had once formed against Edward himself. The wheel of medieval politics had turned full circle, and now they faced the machinery of royal vengeance, operated by someone far more dangerous than Edward had ever been. In 1330, the young Edward III, now 18 and no longer content to be a puppet, struck back against the people who had murdered his father. Mortimer was seized at Nottingham Castle, dragged before Parliament, and executed for treason without trial, the same lawless justice he had once dispensed. Isabella, the she-wolf of France who had toppled one king, was forced into retirement, her political career ended by her own son's calculated revenge. The brutal irony of Edward II's story lay in what his destruction had actually accomplished. The nobles who had killed Gaveston, the Queen who had invaded England, the lords who had forced abdication. All of them believed they were saving the crown from a king who threatened its dignity. Instead, they had established the precedent that English monarchs could be deposed, imprisoned, and murdered by their own subjects when those subjects deemed it necessary. Edward II had been weak, but the system that destroyed him proved to be far more dangerous than his personal failures. The medieval court that was supposed to serve and protect royal authority had shown that it could turn into an execution machine when kings refused to follow the rules written by others. Future monarchs would inherit not just Edward's crown, but the knowledge that their own nobles might someday decide they too had become unfit to rule. The tragedy of Edward II was not that he loved unwisely or trusted the wrong people. It was that he had tried to make medieval kingship into something it could never be. He had wanted to rule as a human being with personal desires and emotional needs, rather than as a political symbol who existed only to serve the state. He had imagined that royal power could protect the things he valued most, when in reality, that power depended on his willingness to sacrifice everything for political necessity. The court system that had destroyed Edward II would survive for centuries, outlasting dozens of kings who learned to play by its rules. But Edward's screams in Berkeley Castle had revealed something fundamental about the nature of royal authority. It was always conditional, always dependent on the consent of those who claimed to serve it, and always vulnerable to the machinery of power when that machinery decided a king had become too dangerous to live. Please subscribe to the channel. The next story is even more unbelievable. The crown had destroyed its wearer, and medieval England had learned that even kings could die when courts decided they had become secrets too scandalous to survive.